One of the biggest decisions we make as card investors is picking which players to target. Now, it seems simple, but getting the right players at the right time is the difference between winning and losing, and it's also the difference between turning a small profit here and there versus actually being able to make real money flipping cards. Now, the challenge is everyone thinks they know sports, so we assume, of course, player selection is going to be easy. But the card market actually doesn't work the way you might think. Sometimes we've got top prospects outselling Hall of Famers. Sometimes great players can actually be terrible investments. So in this video, we're going to walk through how the market actually works, what types of players tend to rise over time compared to those that don't, and then we'll break down why. And my goal for this video is that by the end of this, you're going to have everything you need to make your next investment better than your last one. Let's dive right in. Now, we have to start by acknowledging there are all kinds of things that can impact card values in the short term. So things like injuries or playoff runs, scarcity, social media attention, the market cycles, new products, just basic nostalgia, shifts in the global economy, right? So there's all kinds of things that can have a little bit of an impact. But when we really zoom out, most player values are actually driven by one core thing, and it's a shared belief in the market that demand for that card will be greater in the future than it is today. That's it. And once you understand this, a lot of things in the card market start making a lot more sense. Nobody's paying big money for top prospects because of what they are today. They're paying big money because of what the market believes they could become in the future. The same thing applies to breakout players, GOAT level players, and even declining stars if we're thinking about this from the other perspective with values declining. The market is constantly trying to predict where future demand is headed before it fully happens. Because that's where if you get it right, there's money to be made. So to make this a little easier to understand, I've actually broken this down into 5 different categories of players, and we're going to walk through each one. The first category is prospects, or players who are perceived to have strong future upside. Sometimes when we look at the values of prospect cards, they seem completely illogical, right? Like when you see someone that hasn't even stepped onto the big league field yet, and they're outselling an established all-star or someone that's on a Hall of Fame trajectory, that feels ludicrous, right? Like why would people pay that big money for a player that hasn't even done anything and that could completely fizzle out? And the reason actually isn't as crazy as it might seem. So it's really just that people want to feel like they're getting in early, right? Like they see a player that they believe has some future superstar possibility. And even though it's not certain, they want to feel like they're getting in on the ground floor. And so the market is already pricing in that upside before it fully happens. And sometimes it's never going to happen. We've got to keep that in mind. There's always risk with prospects. Even the professional scouts get it wrong all the time. But this is why top prospects sometimes outsell Hall of Famers, because people believe that there's a chance that they end up being even better than that player in the future. And so the thing to remember here is the market is always trying to buy in on the ground floor compared to what they believe a player could become. This always reminds me of that old Family Guy episode where Peter has to choose between a boat and a mystery box. And he says something to the effect of, well, hold on a minute, a boat's a boat, but the mystery box could be anything. It could even be a boat. And of course, he takes the mystery box and it doesn't work out for him. But, whether or not it makes sense, that's actually kind of how the market treats prospects. Instead of just buying the sure thing, everyone wants to get in on the ground floor and try to predict that next big thing. And it's always because there's this perception that future demand is going to be greater than the current demand for these players. All right, let's talk through a few examples of this. So the first one that comes to mind for me is Victor Wembanyama. So he was expensive as a rookie. He was a mega prospect. Everyone knew this giant with the skill set of a point guard would be a pretty interesting NBA prospect. And so even as an unproven rookie, his card market was strong from day one. And it actually would have paid off massively if you had invested early and just held his cards compared to where they are today. He's proving that he is indeed a superstar caliber player. And a lot of people are looking at him like, man, here's this guy that's already putting up these giant stats. He's still young. He's still projectable. The future is so bright for this guy. So of course it makes sense to pay these big time values for his cards, because it seems like the demand in the future is going to outpace the demand of today. Now, whether or not that's what actually happens remains to be seen. No one can predict the future, of course, but that's the reason people are paying such big price tags for his cards right now. Now, what about a couple of other former top NBA prospects like Ja Morant and Zion Williamson? Both players were extremely expensive as rookies, but they're both selling for a fraction of where they once peaked because they haven't lived up to expectations. So before a player ever makes their debut, before they ever step onto the field or step onto the court, it's hype rather than performance that drives values. And hype is not necessarily based on anything tangible. It's just the excitement that surrounds a player based on what people think they could do. But once the games actually begin, that's where performance takes over as the number one thing that drives values. And if the players don't live up to the expectations that the card market has for them, that's where we see values fall very quickly. And that's exactly what's happened with Zion and Ja. Both of them have been very good when they've been on the court, but they've each had trouble staying on the court. Zion's had some injury issues. He's had some weight problems that are well documented. Ja's had some injuries himself, but he's also had some weird questions come up about his character and his behavior with all the gun stuff. And so when expectations are all the way up here, and this is where values are, but then their performance is all the way down here, and what we actually get from these guys, man, eventually expectations come back down here to meet what they have shown us. And so that's where values fall. Another example will go to the NFL, and Anthony Richardson was a big time prospect coming out of college. He looked like he had all the physicality, all the tools to develop into a star in the NFL, but he just hasn't been able to put it together, at least not yet. And the polish just isn't there. And so people were paying big money for his cards, but since performance didn't meet expectations, values fell sharply. And so the key thing to understand here is that failed prospects are down in value because the market stops believing that the future demand would be higher than the current demand. For a top prospect like Wembanyama, who shows everyone that he's the real deal, values have no reason to stop climbing because people still perceive that the future is going to be brighter than the present. And vice versa, the failed prospects are down in value because the market stopped believing that future demand would be higher than current demand. So there really stopped being a reason to aggressively buy their cards. Now, the challenge here is that the market already knows these players are talented. So thousands of other investors are also trying to figure out who are these future stars and buy into their cards before they fully break out. And that's what makes speculating on players a little bit more difficult because you're not just trying to pick the best players, you're also playing against the market. The next category we'll talk about is players that have positive expectation resets. So when I'm talking about this, I'm talking usually about breakout players. So where the market resets its expectations higher for that player based on performance. Now, this is different from a prospect because with prospects, the market is pricing in the possibility of a better future. But with a breakout player, the market is changing its expectations to align with what the player is showing us that they're capable of. And when the market collectively believes a player is capable of doing more, usually prices are going to rise. A good example of this is Cal Raleigh for the Mariners. So Raleigh was already viewed as a pretty solid player, but his cards were priced for a player that was hitting 30 homers per year. Then he hit 60 homers, and that completely changed what the market believed his ceiling could be. And so, of course, values climbed because the expectations for what his future demand would be also climbed. The market is constantly adjusting its future demand expectations almost in real time. And so this is why breakout seasons can have such a massive impact on values relatively quickly. All right, the next category is established players. Now, this is the category where things get confusing for a lot of people because sometimes a player can be really good and still not be a great investment. So why is that? Well, it's because the market already expects a certain level of performance from each player, and this is already priced into their card values. So values don't rise when a player plays well. They rise when the player exceeds expectations. For example, we're already expecting Josh Allen to go out and throw for 30 touchdowns. So if he does that exact thing, values may not move. But if he throws for 40 touchdowns, he's exceeded our expectations, and so that's where values may pick up a little bit. Now, here's where this gets interesting. The more data we have on a player, the more accurate the market's expectations tend to become. And the more accurate our expectations become, the harder it is for the player to exceed them. And therefore, the more stable their card values become. And this is the difference between a top prospect where it seems like every single at bat can move the entire market compared to a player in year 12 where they might have a massive game, but values barely move. For the prospect, the market is recalibrating its expectations in real time. But for the veteran, they already know who that player is, so one big game really doesn't move their expectations for that player all that much. Now, this applies to all kinds of established players, but it becomes even more noticeable with stars because the expectations are already so high. So let's talk through a couple examples here. The first one is Justin Herbert. So this guy was a great prospect coming out of college. He's been an above average or maybe even a fringe star caliber quarterback for quite a few years now, but he's never escalated into elite territory, at least not yet. And so what's happened with his market? Well, his values are still solid. There's still a group of people that believe in him and like him, but they're down from his peak and they're not actively rising because the market now feels like it has a better idea of who he is, and perhaps more importantly, who he is not. He hasn't shown us that next gear to get to the next level, and that's what's holding his values back. So the next logical question is, what would he have to do for values to actually rise meaningfully from here? Well, he'd have to perform at a level that exceeds the card market's current expectations for him. Another example, this is kind of a fun one. Let me read you the career accolades for this NBA player. So we've got 3-time NBA All-Star, 2-time All-NBA, 3-time NBA rebounding leader, 3-time NBA double-double leader. He's top 10 all-time in NBA history in career double-doubles. Any guesses who this guy is? It's Domantas Sabonis. It's a great example of a guy who is basketball good, but not card market good. And once again, we all know who he is as a player, but we also know what he is not. He's a great player, he's a team player, but he's also not a megastar. And so I would say his values are pretty appropriate right now, even though they're relatively low for an all-star caliber player. We just know who he is. There's not a ton of future potential necessarily. And so for values to rise from here, it would take a move to a different market that maybe gets him more visibility, or he'd have to perform at a level that we're not expecting. Because otherwise, there's no reason for people to believe that future demand is going to outpace current demand. So key takeaway from this category is that being a great player and being a great investment are two different things. All right, next category, this is a fun one. Let's talk about the GOAT caliber players or the legacy players. And this is where the market believes that these guys are going to matter long after they stop playing. So these are the best of the best players, and they're always in high demand. They're the most visible names. They're the guys that everyone knows, and they have massive demand at all times. And what happens with cards of these players is that over time, they disappear into collections and investment portfolios. And it's that combination of high demand and dwindling supply that leads to values rising. Understanding the rarity of a card is a big deal here, and how many copies actually exist. Understanding the perceived scarcity and how readily available or not available a card is. And this is why my long-term investing strategy is always to target the best cards of the best players in the highest grades that I can fit into my budget. Now, the market believes that these types of players are going to be important forever. And with that, the demand is going to be strong forever as well. So this is where guys like Jordan and Brady sell like crazy in the card market. And even guys that are current players but are on that sort of GOAT caliber trajectory like Ohtani or Mahomes or LeBron all have that same kind of appeal. And this also even applies to younger players who appear to be on that GOAT caliber trajectory as well. So this is where a Victor Wembanyama would fit right now. He may not be there yet, but all signs point to him being one of those types of names in the future. So this category is a little bit different than the established players category because we already know who these guys are too, but the thing is they're adding to their legacy with championships, with more counting stats, with increased cultural relevance, and those are the things that can help add value to their cards because those are the types of things that make people believe that future demand is going to outpace current demand. But not every player keeps moving upward forever. And that brings us to our fifth and final category, which is declining players. And so with declining players, there's a perception where demand will be either the same or even lower in the future compared to where it is today. And so the market resets its expectations lower to match. All right, let's talk through a few examples here. So the first one for baseball, we have Nolan Arenado. So he was a rock solid prospect coming up. He ended up kind of exceeding expectations once he got to the majors and was better with the glove than people ever anticipated. And so he had this bat-glove combo that made him a superstar caliber player. And as his stardom was growing, his values were growing too. But then he kind of topped out and people realized, okay, this is who this guy is. He may be a great player, but he never quite made it into the conversation as the true best player in the game. And that's really what held his values back from getting to the next level. And so his card stayed flat for a few years until he started having a few down seasons in a row. And that's where his values started to taper off because expectations had been up here, values were up here to match, and then his performance started to fall, so expectations started to fall to match the new performance. And with that, the values came down to meet those new expectations. Now, what's interesting about this is, at least at the time of this recording, he's actually been really good this season. And so his values are bouncing back a little bit because people are saying, well, wait a minute, he might not be done after all. And he's adding to his legacy here. He's adding counting stats. And so there's this perception now, at least among a small pocket of people, where future demand could outpace current demand once again. A year or two ago, we might have said that, man, this guy looks washed up, so there's no reason to buy his cards anymore. And that's where you see the fall off. All right, another example of this, Aaron Rodgers. So one of the best quarterbacks of all time, he was on that GOAT trajectory for a while, and his cards also were climbing a ton. But the lack of rings really kind of held him back from ever elevating into the same category as like a Tom Brady, for example. And now he's in the twilight of his career. He's not as good as he used to be, which I don't know how you would be if you're over 40 years old playing in the NFL still. But as a result, his values are down each of the past few years because people are a little bit less excited about his cards compared to when he really did look like he could challenge to take the crown as the GOAT in the NFL. All right, last example here, Giannis Antetokounmpo in the NBA. So we have a guy that, again, was a rising star. He was one of those guys that was in the conversation as, man, if this guy could develop a little bit of his game, kind of polish his jumper a little bit, man, he could elevate and become one of the inner circle greats of the game. And he's been very, very good. He's won MVPs. He took a small market team to a championship. So there's a lot to like here, but he also hasn't kind of elevated into that next level. And so, yes, he's a superstar of the game, but I don't think people see him as a potential GOAT the way that they once might have. And so same thing here, you saw his expectations sky high and values were up there to meet them. But now people are thinking about him like we kind of know what he is and we kind of know what he's not. And so with that, the expectations have kind of tapered off or even fallen a little bit. And with that, values have fallen as well the past couple of years. Now he's still young enough to still have a chance to make a big impact, especially if he goes to a different team like it seems like has been the rumor for the past few years. We'll see if a move is actually made, but that could certainly shake up his values again. And so this is the other side of the equation. So just like expectations can rise quickly for prospects and for breakout players, they can also fall over time. And sometimes it's because of age, sometimes injuries, sometimes it's declining performance, and sometimes it's just because the market realizes that the player may not actually live up to their full potential that people once thought they had. And so when the market starts lowering its expectations for future demand, that is when values usually follow. Once you understand all of this, you start realizing something important. Speculating on player performance is hard. And so if your entire strategy is built around predicting future player performance, man, you can make a lot of money if you're right, but it's just hard to do. Timelines are also completely uncertain here. So even if you are right, it could take months or even years to pay off. And the market already prices in expectations for each player pretty aggressively. So like we've talked about, values only rise when the player exceeds those already lofty expectations. And so winning at that game is a lot different than just picking who you think is going to have a good year this season. So if you're constantly picking players and you're sick of inconsistent results, it's because you're playing the wrong game. And personally, I prefer strategies where the outcomes are more controllable, where the timelines are more clearly defined, and where we don't actually have to get the exact right player every single time. We just have to stick with the players that are liquid enough in the short term, but then the actual longer term doesn't really matter that much. So this is where strategies like grading and knowing how to find quick flip opportunities and understanding the market patterns to play the seasonal timing game are all ways to win without needing to predict the future. And if you want to master these strategies so you can grow your card income, I want to personally invite you to join my card investing community, Ignite. Inside is where we can teach you how to execute these strategies and then give you personalized support so you never get stuck along the way as you take action. If that sounds at all interesting, click the link in the description and you can see full details. But guys, once you understand how the market actually works here, player selection becomes a lot clearer. And remember, the name of the game here is to find players where there's a shared belief in the market that demand for that card and for that player will be greater in the future than it is today. Don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you on the next video.